Hey guys, what's going on? We are going to do a couple different videos here on the Great Depression. Basically what we're going to focus on right now is what caused the Great Depression and what was the early response to the Great Depression. So, what you'll need for this, all right, you should find two things on Canvas that are important. One, a cause of the Great Depression student handout. It's just kind of big graphic organizer. It's just a way for you to take some notes. If you'd rather do notes in a notebook, if you feel like that's going to benefit you, do that. It doesn't matter to me. And then you'll need this Intro to Great Depression video guide. I posted a link to the video. You don't need to watch the whole video, just a small part of it. All right. Again, everything you need is on Canvas. So let's kind of get started here. All right. So first of all, the gentleman you see listed here is, or pictured here, is Herbert Hoover. He's the President of the United States. We can look at this quote, which got a little cut off, so I'll slide this over so you can see a little better. All right. Is that why we in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever? For in the history of any land, we have not yet reached the goal, but given a chance to go forward with the policies of the last 8 years, we shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation. Okay, so this is about a year and a half before the Great Depression will begin. Um, Herbert Hoover is one of the great figures in history who's been fairly or unfairly blamed and ridiculed for his response to the Great Depression. As you can see over here, I got some questions. Is he naive? Is he stupid? Why might he think this way? Uh, Here's the thing, like, was he naive or stupid? Probably, right? The reality is no economy ever stays great forever. Sadly, we're kind of seeing that now. Um, why was he thinking this way? Well, we'll get into some of the stuff in the video we watched before about the 1920s. Unemployment was exceptionally low. The companies were making unbelievable profits. You would look at the decade of the 1920s from an economic standpoint, and you would say, this is amazing. The problem was what he didn't realize was all these underlying issues that were going to tear down the economy that never got addressed. All right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about the long-term causes, which aren't that long-term. It's more like the last years leading up to it, and then the short-term shocks that get us a Great Depression, if that makes sense. All right, let's get going. So number one thing, we slide this back over so you can see everything on the screen. As I alluded to before, when we talked about the 1920s, the 1920s was this kind of, in this return to normalcy, this period where government and businesses worked very closely with one another and the government tried to stay out of their way. Again, reminding us a little of the Gilded Age, I would guess. It seems like a reasonable connection. But let's talk about the things that they did that would be considered pro-business. All right, first of all, tariffs to protect companies. We alluded this before. Tariffs can help a company, all right, but the problem is I have right here. It says it led to rate wars. That's the big takeaway. You're going to raise tariffs on their stuff, right? We talked about some of the Forder-McCumbie tariff from earlier in the 20s that gave the president the unbelievable power to jack up tariffs. Well, there's a downside of that, rate wars. All right, the other issue, taxes were lower in the wealthy and corporations. All right, as we talked about during the war, again, 1918, we should see that 77%. That's insane. No, that's the war, right? And then basically what winds up happening is it keeps coming down lower and lower and lower. Um, when you watch the video, you'll kind of get a sense of why that might have been a mistake. All right. And last thing, the government, because they didn't believe in taking a strong stance on regulation, there were a couple different industries that were clearly doing things they shouldn't have been doing. Stock purchases, we'll get to that in a second. The credit industry, we'll get to that in a second. And farming, as we kind of alluded to, there was a chance for them to make some serious legislation to help struggling uh, uh, farming communities, but the reality is they decided not to. Now, is this the only reason? Of course not. But the government had saw some cracks and did nothing about it. All right, a slowing industry. As we talked about when we watched the video, what we saw during the 1920s is this rise of consumerism. People were buying things left and right. Now, here's the problem with that, right? The big issue is this, right? Companies only, or not so many companies, people only need so many things, right? Realistically, if you buy a car, you're not buying another car for a while, or you're buying a refrigerator, not buying another refrigerator for a while. And when you keep making tons and tons and tons of them and no one's buying them anymore, that's bad for business because you spend all this money, you've had all this revenue and resources tied up in a product that no one's going to buy. And so what does that mean? Eventually, they're going to have to stop making them. And when it's having to stop making them, that means people start to lose jobs. So obviously, you know, it's a weird time in history, right? At this point in the 1920s, all these new stuff comes out on the market, and people are more than happy to go and buy because it means a more modern, easier lifestyle. But then the downside is that everyone buys them all at once. And then the other issue I want to stress here is besides having too many of certain things is that if you want to go out and buy all that stuff, that's cool. But as an adult, I'll tell you right now, you don't run out and buy cars, dishwashers, vacuum cleaners, and all these expensive luxury items or consumer goods at once. Why? Because you can't afford it. But what happened was a lot of these consumers or a lot of these companies provided credit, and people were more than happy to take the credit. And credit is good if you can pay it, but if you can't pay it, then they start to take your stuff. All right, let's keep going. Next thing, the collapse of farms. I kind of alluded to this before when we talked about legislation in the 1920s. But the thing we want to really stress here is if you start looking at this chart over here, and I know it's a little cut off, it's 1932 to 33, the price of food has just dropped dramatically. If your corn is essentially a third of the price it was in 1912 or 1913, there is no profit for you. There is no making money for you as a farmer. You just won't survive. And as you go down this list, it's not hard to see why farmers went out of business because they weren't making any money. Now, why did this become a huge problem? Okay. So, farmers began to overproduce in World War One. We talked about this before. They were told to, it was their patriotic duty to do that. So they started ramping up production. They also began to expand the amount of farmland they were using. So all this food's now flooding the market, and that was necessary during the war. But when the war ends, you don't need quite as much. All right. And then you throw on top of that the recovery of European farmers who suddenly could flood our market as well, which drove down the prices even further. And I know this is really cut off. See if I can get this little part down here for you. But basically, the big idea is that um, the average family is making $750 a year in 1929. The average farmer family is making $275 a year. That is not math that's going to add up. That's going to lead to disaster. All right, consumer issues. Kind of alluded to this one before. People kept using credit. Again, credit is useful at times if you need to buy something really big, if you don't overuse it. The problem was everybody was using it and everybody was lending and nobody was watching it and nobody was thinking about, well, what happens if people can't pay us back? All right. And okay, it's really easy to look back at these people and go, what a bunch of idiots. Why did you buy all this stuff? Didn't you know what was going to happen? But again, going back to consumer culture, suddenly with mass media, radio, papers, magazines, all of it feeding this kind of like, I'm gonna use the expression, keeping up with the Joneses. I think you know what that means, right? You think you need to buy this stuff because your neighbor's buying it. That just gets into people's heads and they just keep buying it. And then, as I mentioned, I think before, the invention of catalogs, we think Amazon online shopping is pretty amazing, but at that time, you could get this catalog book in the mail. You could literally go through it, call up, they would pay, you could use credit to buy stuff, and they would send it to your house. You didn't even have to go anywhere to get it. It would come to you. And, for people who live maybe in the middle of nowhere where stores weren't all that popular or weren't that many, this meant opened up a lot more opportunities and possibilities to them. Now, the other major issue here is this. If we start to look over here, we begin to see how much money was being basically earned by the average worker compared to the wealthy, right? These are issues that people have kind of circled back to in more recent years that basically everyone was doing well. The wealthy were doing exceptionally well. Um, and wages were rising, they just weren't rising that quickly. And so think about it. You are suddenly buying all these consumer goods, which means you now have monthly payments on these things. And your wages are going up, but not going up that much, so you're not really able to keep up all that well. And so there's not this kind of like you're not swimming in money. You're kind of getting by. And you're getting all this new stuff. So it feels like you're doing really well, but the reality is you don't really have any money saved and you're kind of living paycheck to paycheck. All right. So again, the big thing I want to stress here is that yes, money was being made by everybody. Wages were climbing, but the wages of the average worker weren't climbing at nearly the rate of the wealthy. And all that debt they were taking on buying all those consumer goods brought them down. All right, going international here. So I'm going to kind of streamline this as much as I can. Uh, Europe was struggling economically. This war devastated them in many ways. They took on tons of debt, as point number two says, as did we. But there's a little bit of a difference here, right? Um, the expression from the video we watched on 1920s called this group of writers the lost generation. That term is also used to often describe the young generation of men who were killed during World War One. Um, those are consumers. Those are workers who just suddenly just are gone. And that was devastating to the economies of these countries. And so, because we weren't hit as hard, we weren't destroyed physically or even like from a demographic standpoint, we were able to recover much faster. The war debt, man, the war is expensive. Didn't really talk about it very much, but all the new weapons of World War One that suddenly were necessary to fight the war, you had to. Everyone was buying them, and it cost a lot of money, and so these countries went in deep, deep debt. And then the other thing we want to briefly mention here, because it's kind of the part of that story that gets us to World War Two, is Germany and the reparations and the collapse of the Weimar Republic and the hyperinflation that took place there. And I don't know if they'll talk about that in the exam, but it's worth noting that like everybody was struggling in the 1920s, really except for us. And then to make things worse, we will see the basically increased isolationism, particularly from us. The video you're going to watch is going to talk about the Hawley Smoot tariff and what it did, but everyone's kind of cutting off trade. So, hey, Woodrow Wilson warned us. We just didn't listen to him on that issue. All right, the stock market. All right, this is the last long-term issue. So here's the thing: as you look at this chart here, the stock market was going gangbusters here. People were making so much money. You think it started in 1920 at 100 points. All right, and by the eve of the collapse, we're looking at almost 400 points, a 400% increase. That's insane. It is so much money. All right, but here's the thing. Um, Once everyone starts making that kind of money, everybody wants in the stock market. So then it becomes a feeding frenzy. So like smart investors know what they're doing. Late investors are just buying what everyone else is buying, and they're buying at high prices because it's been driven up by the smart investors. Now the smart investors bought early, so they got it cheap. The late investors bought late, so they paid more, and they didn't have the money. So here comes the problem. All right, people begin to borrow money from banks to buy stocks. And so instead of having the cash to pay for that stock, they wound up just borrowing money from the bank with basically no collateral. So they basically took out like a 95% loan. Normally you put down 20%. These guys are taking out insane loans. And the banks are doing it because they're looking at this 20% a year, 20% a year. Well, of course, it's a great investment. They don't care about the interest because it's making 20% a year. Even if you're paying 8% interest a year, you'll pay that off with no problem. The issue will be stock markets are going to collapse. And this is a huge problem that the government could have regulated, but ultimately did not. All right, we're going to run through these real quick. These are short-term shocks of the Great Depression, not really causes. So, crash of stock market. Obviously, this is going to be a big problem. As you can see here, right, we start seeing some mini crashes, right? 11% but recovered, so only a 2% loss. Then we see Black Monday fell 11%, Black Tuesday fell 13%. Man, if you're watching the news right now, this sounds awfully familiar, and it's kind of scary stuff. Now, the thing we want to know is here, investors lost roughly $30 billion by November of 1929. Go back to what I just talked about. Much of that stock was purchased by people on loan. So now these people have to pay back a debt they don't have the money for. All right. Run on banks. This is a big one. Okay. So people panicked because banks were basically out of cash. People wanted to pull out their savings because they got scared, um, because they're afraid the banks were all going to go under. The problem is banks don't actually carry all the cash; they lend it out. So when everyone starts looking to get their money back, they can't get it. So what winds up happening is over 9,000 banks will collapse. 9 million individual savings accounts will be wiped out. So as the depression is starting, basically you can't get your money that you had saved. The banks that used to exist are now gone. All right. Again, this doesn't cause it. This is more of a shock that spurs it, makes it worse. And the last one is kind of obvious, right? Unemployment prior to the crash is 3.2%, unbelievably low. But as you can see, by 1932, it's going to climb to 24%. So much of a depression is caused by consumer confidence. Once confidence is knocked, people stop spending money. Well, then they start saving money, and that just builds and builds and builds and builds. So people stop buying, people stop hiring, and then you've got yourself a depression. All right. So I hope this was helpful. Go ahead and pull out that video guide. I'll explain what you got to do with that in a second.